The night the most famous billionaire in America stopped his acceptance speech and looked directly at me, every secret we had spent 3 years protecting began to fall apart. I remember the exact weight of the invitation in my hands. Thick ivory cardstock, gold lettering, the kind of invitation that belonged in a museum display case instead of the tiny apartment kitchen where I stood staring at it. Outside my window, Manhattan glowed beneath a cold October drizzle. Yellow taxi lights blurred into streaks against the wet streets below. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and disappeared into the city noise. My coffee had gone cold nearly an hour earlier, but I kept holding the mug anyway. It gave my trembling hands something to do. The invitation sat on the counter beside me like a challenge. Business Leader of the Year Gala. Ethan Blackwood. Honoree. My chest tightened just reading his name. 3 years. 3 years of hidden dinners, hidden vacations, hidden birthdays, hidden everything. 3 years of watching the world speculate about the billionaire they thought they knew while keeping silent about the man I actually knew. The man who laughed at terrible movies. The man who always ordered extra fries and pretended they were for me. The man who called every night no matter what city he was in. Nobody at that gala knew any of that. To them, Ethan Blackwood was a legend. The billionaire founder whose face appeared on magazine covers and financial news broadcasts. The man who could move stock prices with a single interview. The man everyone admired. Or envied. Or both. To me, he was just Ethan. And somehow that made everything harder. I should have stayed home. That thought followed me the entire ride downtown. The black sedan moved through rain-soaked streets while city lights reflected across the windows like liquid gold. My reflection stared back at me. Simple navy dress. Minimal makeup. Blonde hair pinned neatly behind my shoulders. Nobody would look twice at me. That was the point. It had always been the point. Stay unnoticed. Stay invisible. Stay safe. The hotel appeared ahead like a palace carved from light. Valets moved beneath enormous glass awnings. Cameras flashed near the entrance. Luxury cars lined the curb for nearly half a block. My stomach twisted. This wasn't my world. It never had been. I was a public school art teacher from Brooklyn. I spent my days helping children paint sunsets and finger paint dinosaurs. Most of my students thought billionaires only existed in movies. Yet somehow I had fallen in love with one. Inside, crystal chandeliers scattered light across marble floors. Conversations floated through the ballroom like music. Men in tailored tuxedos. Women draped in designer gowns. Wealth everywhere. Confidence everywhere. I felt completely out of place. Exactly as I always did at events like this. So I took the seat Ethan had arranged for me. Row 12. Near the back. Far from the cameras. Far from the attention. Hidden. The way we had always been. Then the lights dimmed. Applause thundered across the ballroom. Ethan walked onto the stage. Tall. Calm. Effortlessly composed. The entire room rose to its feet. I stayed seated, my heart beating too fast. Because while everyone else saw America's favorite billionaire, I saw the man who had kissed my forehead goodbye just 48 hours earlier and promised he'd call when the event was over. Ethan reached the podium. The applause slowly faded. He adjusted the microphone and smiled. Then something happened that wasn't supposed to happen. His eyes moved across the crowd, past the investors, past the celebrities, past the politicians, until they found me. And when they did, his expression changed. For a moment, I forgot there were 800 people in the ballroom. The applause had faded. The cameras were focused on the stage. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, scattering light across polished marble and perfectly arranged tables. Yet none of that mattered. Ethan was looking directly at me. Not toward my section. Not somewhere near me. At me. The corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. A smile so small nobody else would have noticed it. But I did. I always did. My pulse jumped. 3 years together had taught me every expression he tried to hide from the rest of the world. The public saw confidence. Investors saw leadership. Reporters saw a billionaire worth billions of dollars. I saw the tiny shift in his eyes whenever he was nervous. And right then, standing under the brightest spotlight in America, Ethan Blackwood looked nervous. It lasted less than a second. Then the expression vanished. The billionaire returned. Calm. Controlled. Untouchable. The room leaned forward as he began speaking. His voice rolled smoothly through the ballroom speakers. Thanking colleagues. Recognizing partners. mentioning the employees who helped build his company from a startup operating out of a rented office into one of the most valuable technology firms in the country. The audience loved every word. Laughter arrived exactly when expected. Applause followed every major point. The entire speech was perfect, but I barely heard any of it, because something felt wrong. Ethan never looked at me during public events. That was one of our rules. One of many. No public recognition. No photographs together. No social media appearances. No accidental attention. We protected our relationship by pretending it did not exist. It had worked for 3 years. Yet twice during the first 10 minutes of his speech, I caught him glancing toward row 12. Toward me. My fingers tightened around the folded program resting in my lap. The paper crinkled softly. Around me, guests nodded approvingly at his remarks. A man at the next table whispered something about stock performance. A woman nearby mentioned a magazine cover. Nobody had any idea what was happening. Then Ethan said something unexpected. "Success is a strange thing," he told the audience. "People assume it changes your life overnight. They imagine private jets and boardrooms and headlines. But the truth is, the most important moments usually happen when nobody is watching." My breath caught. The words sounded harmless enough. The audience responded with polite smiles. Yet I knew Ethan. Those were not lines written by his public relations team. Those were his words. Real words. Personal words. The kind he rarely shared with anyone. My stomach twisted. He continued speaking, but my mind drifted somewhere else. Back to a rainy afternoon 3 years earlier. Back before magazine covers. Before secret rules. Before hidden dinners and late-night phone calls. Back to a small coffee shop in Brooklyn where I had been grading student art projects at a corner table. I remembered the smell of espresso. The sound of rain tapping against the windows. The old acoustic music playing softly through worn speakers. I remembered a stranger asking if the empty seat across from me was taken. I remembered looking up and seeing Ethan Blackwood for the first time. Except back then, he had not introduced himself as a billionaire. He had simply smiled and said, "Mind if I sit here for a minute?" And I had no idea that single question was about to change the course of my entire life. I looked up from the stack of student drawings spread across my table and saw a man standing beside the empty chair across from me. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his charcoal coat. A few drops still clung to his dark hair. He looked like someone who belonged in a corporate boardroom, not a neighborhood coffee shop tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore in Brooklyn. Yet there was nothing flashy about him. No entourage. No expensive watch displayed for attention. No hint that his face would one day appear on television screens across the country. Just a tired-looking stranger holding a paper cup and offering a polite smile. "Mind if I sit here for a minute?" he asked. I glanced around the crowded cafe. Every other seat was taken. "Go ahead," I said. He thanked me and settled into the chair. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Soft acoustic guitar drifted from overhead speakers. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter. Outside, people hurried through the rain beneath umbrellas that tilted in the wind. I returned to grading artwork from my third-grade class. Construction paper trees, crayon sunsets, stick figure families. The stranger seemed focused on his coffee until one of the drawings slid off my stack and fluttered to the floor. Before I could reach it, he picked it up. A crooked drawing of a golden retriever wearing sunglasses. The student had labeled it Captain Pickles. The stranger stared at it for a second longer than necessary. Then he laughed. A genuine laugh. Warm. Unexpected. "Captain Pickles?" he asked. "He protects the city from boredom," I explained. "Very important work." Another laugh escaped him. "Sounds more qualified than most executives I know." I smiled despite myself. Something about him felt easy. Familiar. Which made no sense because we had never met. The conversation should have ended there. Normally it would have. But 30 minutes later we were still talking. About books. About New York. About terrible subway delays and favorite pizza places. He never mentioned business. Never mentioned money. Never mentioned fame. He asked questions instead. Real questions. The kind that made me feel like my answers mattered. By the time the rain began to slow outside, I realized nearly an hour had passed. I checked my phone and jumped. "I am late," I said, gathering my papers. "Parent-teacher conference?" he guessed. I blinked. "How did you know?" He pointed toward the drawings. "Lucky guess." I laughed and slid everything into my canvas bag. As I stood, he hesitated. Just for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. Simple, white, minimal. In case Captain Pickles ever needs legal representation, he said. I accepted the card with a smile. The moment my eyes dropped to the name, my breath caught. Ethan Blackwood. Even then, standing beneath the warm cafe lights with rain tapping softly against the windows, I knew that name. Everyone did. And suddenly the stranger sitting across from me was not a stranger anymore. The business card felt heavier than paper should have. I stood outside the coffee shop beneath the striped awning while rain dripped steadily from the edge above me. Cars rolled past on the wet street. People hurried by carrying umbrellas. Yet for several seconds, I could only stare at the name printed in clean black letters. Ethan Blackwood. The Ethan Blackwood. Founder. Billionaire. Media favorite. The man whose interviews occasionally played on television screens mounted in the teacher's lounge at school. I looked back through the cafe window. He was still sitting at the table, finishing his coffee as though he had not casually revealed he was one of the most recognizable business leaders in America. When he glanced up and caught me looking, he smiled and gave a small wave. I immediately looked away. My face burned. The subway ride home felt unreal. I kept pulling the card from my coat pocket just to make sure I had not imagined it. By the time I reached my apartment, I had convinced myself I would never hear from him again. Men like Ethan Blackwood did not spend their evenings talking to elementary school teachers. They certainly did not call them afterward, which was why I nearly dropped my phone 3 days later when his name appeared on the screen. I stared at it until the ringing almost stopped. Then I answered. Hello, I said cautiously. I was beginning to think Captain Pickles scared you away, Ethan replied. His voice carried the same warmth it had in the coffee shop. I found myself smiling before I could stop it. That phone call lasted 47 minutes. Then another happened 2 days later. Then another. Weeks passed. Slowly, conversations became dinners. Dinners became routines. Routines became something neither of us seemed willing to define out loud. One cold December evening, we walked through Bryant Park after dinner. Holiday lights glowed from every direction. Ice skaters circled beneath strings of white bulbs. The scent of hot chocolate drifted through the air. Snowflakes floated lazily from a gray sky. Ethan stopped beside a row of illuminated trees and looked unusually serious. My stomach tightened immediately. What is it? I asked. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets and exhaled slowly. For the first time since I had met him, he seemed uncertain. Grace, he said quietly, if we keep doing this, there is something I need to ask you. The crowd moved around us. Laughter echoed from the skating rink. Somewhere nearby, a child pointed excitedly at the lights. Yet suddenly it felt like we were standing alone in the middle of Manhattan. Okay, I said. Ethan studied me for a moment before speaking again. Nobody can know about us. The words landed harder than I expected. My smile faded. What? He looked away briefly toward the city skyline before returning his gaze to mine. No interviews. No photographs. No public appearances together. No social media. Nothing. Snow settled lightly on his dark coat. I searched his face for an explanation. Why? I asked. His expression softened. Because the moment the world finds out about you, your life changes forever. And not in ways you would like. I should have walked away. Maybe a smarter woman would have. But standing beneath those lights, looking into his eyes, I realized I already cared far more than I should have. Then Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. These are the rules, he said with a nervous laugh. I actually wrote them down. I stared at him in disbelief. You made relationship rules? I made terrible relationship rules, he admitted. And despite everything, I laughed. I had no idea that agreeing to those rules would shape the next 3 years of my life. The rules should have made everything feel impossible. Instead, somehow, they became the foundation of the happiest months of my life. Ethan folded the paper and handed it to me beneath the glow of the holiday lights. I remember reading the list while trying not to laugh. Rule number 1, no public photographs together. Rule number 2, no discussing the relationship with reporters. Rule number 3, if either of us became uncomfortable, we would tell the truth immediately. The first 2 sounded like they belonged in a legal contract. The third sounded surprisingly vulnerable. When I looked up, Ethan was watching me carefully. You realize this is completely ridiculous, right? I asked. Absolutely, he admitted. Then why are you smiling? His smile widened. Because you are still standing here. That winter became a collection of small moments. The kind that never appeared in newspapers. The kind no camera ever captured. Saturday mornings at a bookstore downtown where nobody recognized him beneath a baseball cap. Quiet dinners in restaurants hidden on side streets. Long phone calls that stretched past midnight when he was traveling for work. I learned that Ethan drank far too much coffee when he was stressed. He learned that I graded papers while watching cooking shows I never actually paid attention to. The world saw a billionaire building companies. I saw a man who forgot where he left his car keys at least twice a week. One snowy evening, he showed up outside my apartment carrying a grocery bag filled with ingredients. "What is all this?" I asked. "Dinner," he said confidently. "You cook." Not successfully. The next 90 minutes produced smoke, a ruined pasta sauce, and one of the funniest nights I had experienced in years. We eventually ordered pizza. Ethan declared the evening a culinary victory anyway. Spring arrived. Then summer. Months passed faster than they should have. Sometimes he would pick me up after school, and we would drive north without a destination. Windows down. Music playing softly. The city shrinking behind us. Those drives became my favorite part of every week. No meetings. No interviews. No headlines. Just Ethan. Yet the secret always remained between us. Invisible but present. When we walked together, we chose quieter streets. When major events appeared on television, I watched from my couch while he attended alone. Occasionally, I would see him standing beside politicians, celebrities, or executives. The entire country seemed fascinated by his life. Nobody knew I had spoken to him an hour earlier. Nobody knew he had texted me a picture of a terrible airport sandwich while waiting for a delayed flight. Sometimes the secrecy felt romantic. Other times it felt strange, like living in two different worlds at once. One belonged to Grace Carter, elementary school teacher from Brooklyn. The other belonged to a secret that only existed behind closed doors. Still, I convinced myself it was enough. Because every time doubt appeared, Ethan found a way to make it disappear. Until one afternoon nearly a year later, when a stranger approached our table during lunch, stared at Ethan for several seconds, and said 5 words that changed everything. "You are Ethan Blackwood, right?" My heart stopped for half a second. The restaurant suddenly felt smaller, brighter, louder. We had chosen the place because it was quiet, tucked between a flower shop and an antique bookstore on a side street most tourists never found. For nearly a year, it had worked. Then a man in his 50s carrying a leather briefcase paused beside our table and looked directly at Ethan. "You are Ethan Blackwood, right?" he asked. Ethan did not hesitate. He smiled politely and stood to shake the man's hand. "I am." The man looked delighted. Within seconds, he was talking about quarterly earnings reports and a recent interview Ethan had given. I sat quietly, stirring my iced tea while pretending not to notice the shift in atmosphere. People at nearby tables began glancing over. One person pulled out a phone. Another whispered something to a friend. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody caused a scene. Yet I felt the invisible wall rise between us. The same wall that always appeared whenever the outside world recognized who Ethan really was. After a few minutes, the man left. The restaurant returned to normal, at least on the surface. Ethan sat back down, but his expression had changed. He looked distracted, careful, watching the room. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "Of course." But I knew him too well to believe that answer. The drive home felt quieter than usual. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Streetlights reflected across the glass in long streaks of gold. Ethan kept one hand on the steering wheel while the city rolled past outside. Finally, I broke the silence. "You hate when that happens, do not you?" He exhaled slowly. "Not because someone recognizes me." "Then why?" He was quiet for several seconds. "Because every time it happens, I wonder if someone will recognize you too." I looked out the passenger window. "Nobody knows who I am." "Exactly." His voice softened. "And I would like to keep it that way." Part of me understood. Another part was beginning to grow tired. Tired of hidden reservations under assumed names. Tired of checking photographs online after every event. Tired of feeling like a secret whenever the rest of the world entered the room. The feeling grew stronger as the months passed. By our second year together, Ethan's company was expanding faster than ever. Magazine covers appeared almost monthly. Financial networks discussed him constantly. Invitations arrived from charity galas, business summits, and international conferences. Sometimes he would call me from London. Sometimes from Los Angeles. Sometimes from private terminals I had never even heard of before. Yet no matter how far away he traveled, he always called. Every night, without fail. And still, the secret remained. Then one evening, everything became more complicated. I was grading math assignments at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed. A text message from my best friend, Olivia. Attached was a screenshot from an entertainment news website. I opened it without thinking. The headline sat at the top of the screen in bold letters. According to multiple sources, Ethan Blackwood is expected to announce an engagement within the next year. My hands froze above the table. Then I noticed the photograph underneath. Ethan was standing beside a beautiful woman at a charity event. They were smiling for cameras. And for the first time in 2 years, doubt slipped quietly into my heart. For several seconds, I could not breathe. The screenshot remained frozen on my phone while the noise of my apartment faded into the background. The dishwasher hummed softly in the kitchen. Traffic moved somewhere beyond my window. Yet all I could see was Ethan standing beside a woman I had never met. She was elegant, confident, beautiful in the effortless way magazine covers seemed to prefer. The article claimed she came from one of the most influential families in the country. According to anonymous sources, their appearance together had fueled growing speculation about a future engagement. I read the paragraph 3 times, then a fourth, each time hoping I had misunderstood something. My phone buzzed again. Olivia, please tell me this is not true. I stared at the message without replying. Because I did not know. That was the problem. For the first time in more than 2 years, I did not know. Ethan called an hour later. The familiar sound of his ringtone usually made me smile. This time it made my stomach tighten. I answered anyway. Hey, he said. His voice sounded warm. Familiar. Completely unaware that my world had tilted sideways. How was your day? I looked at the article still glowing on my screen. Interesting. Silence lingered for a moment. Everything okay? He asked. I could have asked immediately. I should have. Instead, I hesitated. Because part of me was afraid of the answer. I saw an article about you. I finally said. Another pause. Longer this time. Which one? My grip tightened around the phone. The one saying you are expected to announce an engagement. The silence that followed felt endless. I moved toward the window and stared down at the city lights below. Across the street, someone was walking a golden retriever through the evening drizzle. Normal life continued everywhere except inside my chest. Grace, Ethan said quietly. It is not what you think. I closed my eyes. Those words rarely comforted anyone. Then tell me what it is. He exhaled slowly. The woman in that photo is Victoria Langford. Our companies are working on a major partnership. We attended the same event. That is all. I wanted to believe him. Part of me did. But another part was exhausted. Exhausted from hearing about important people I could never meet. Exhausted from reading stories about the man I loved instead of standing beside him. Do you know what hurts? I asked softly. It is not the article. Ethan did not interrupt. It is the fact that complete strangers know more about your public life than I do. The words hung between us. Heavy, honest, necessary. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Ethan surprised me. You are right. I opened my eyes. What? You are right, he repeated. And I have been asking you to carry a burden that gets heavier every year. My heart twisted. Because there was sadness in his voice now. Real sadness. The kind he almost never revealed. Grace, I need you to trust me a little longer. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass. How much longer? Another pause. Then he answered with a sentence that would keep me awake for weeks. Until I can finally tell the world the truth. The promise should have comforted me. Instead, it haunted me. Days turned into weeks, and those words followed me everywhere. Until I can finally tell the world the truth. I repeated them while grading papers, while riding the subway, while lying awake at 2 in the morning staring at the ceiling above my bed. The problem was not that I doubted Ethan loved me. The problem was that I no longer knew when our future would arrive. There was always another project, another acquisition, another board meeting, another reason to wait. Spring faded into summer. Summer drifted toward fall. The secret remained exactly where it had always been. Hidden, untouched, unchanged. One Friday afternoon, I found myself standing alone in my classroom after the final bell. The room was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Sunlight spilled through the windows, illuminating dozens of student paintings hanging on the walls. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask a question I had spent too long avoiding. What if this never changes? The thought settled heavily in my chest. That evening, Ethan called from California. I watched his name appear on my screen and felt something unfamiliar. Exhaustion. Not anger. Not sadness. Just exhaustion. We talked for nearly 30 minutes. He told me about meetings. I told him about my students. We laughed about a boy who had painted a purple dinosaur wearing cowboy boots. Everything sounded normal. Yet underneath every word, a distance had begun to grow. By the time we said goodnight, I realized neither of us had mentioned our future once. 3 days later, I made a decision. The apartment felt strangely quiet as I sat at my kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Cars rolled through puddles below. The city continued moving while I stared at the page. I started writing. Not because I wanted to leave. Because I could not keep standing still. The letter took nearly 2 hours. I rewrote entire paragraphs. Crossed out sentences. Started over again. When I finally finished, tears blurred the ink near the bottom of the page. I folded it carefully and placed it inside an envelope with Ethan's name written across the front. Then I packed a single suitcase. Clothes. Books. A few photographs. Nothing more. The next morning, before sunrise, I left Manhattan behind. The train carried me north through gray skies and quiet towns. My phone remained silent beside me. I had turned it off before boarding. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan did not know where I was. The realization hurt more than I expected. Yet as miles of countryside rolled past the window, another feeling slowly emerged beneath the sadness. Relief. Small at first, then stronger. By late afternoon, I arrived at a lakeside town nearly 4 hours away. The air smelled like pine trees and rain. Water stretched across the horizon beneath a blanket of clouds. Nobody recognized me. Nobody knew Ethan Blackwood. Nobody knew our secret. I rented a small cottage overlooking the lake and carried my suitcase inside. The silence felt enormous. Peaceful. Terrifying. Necessary. Then, just as the sun disappeared behind the distant hills, my phone lit up for the first time. 23 missed calls. Every single one from Ethan. 23 missed calls. I stared at the screen while the last traces of daylight disappeared beyond the lake. The cottage felt smaller suddenly. The silence no longer peaceful. Just heavy. I lowered myself onto the edge of the sofa and scrolled through the notifications. 23 calls. 11 text messages. 4 voicemails. Every one from Ethan. My chest tightened. For a moment, I considered deleting everything without listening. Starting over completely. A new town. A new routine. A life that belonged only to me. Then my phone buzzed again. His name appeared on the screen. I froze. The ringing echoed through the quiet room. Once. Twice. 3 times. Finally, it stopped. A second later, another message arrived. Grace, please answer. I need to explain. I closed my eyes. The words from my letter returned to me. I love you. I always will. But I cannot keep waiting for a future that never seems to arrive. At the time, writing them had felt impossible. Reading them now felt worse. Outside, gentle waves rolled against the shoreline. Wind rustled through the trees surrounding the cottage. Everything felt distant. Unreal. I picked up the phone and pressed play on the first voicemail. Ethan's voice filled the room immediately. Grace, I got your letter. A pause followed. Longer than normal. As though he was choosing every word carefully. I know why you left. I should have seen it sooner. My throat tightened. I listened to the rest without moving. Then the second voicemail. Then the third. Each one sounded more exhausted than the last. Not angry. Not frustrated. Just tired. Heartbroken. By the fourth message, I found myself staring out the window at the dark lake while his voice continued speaking. Then he said something that made me stop breathing. You always thought I was hiding you because I was protecting my reputation. Silence filled the recording for several seconds. The truth is, I was protecting you. I sat upright. Every nerve in my body suddenly alert. The message continued. There were legal issues years ago. People digging through my life. Lawsuits. Investigations. Reporters trying to uncover anything they could use. Every relationship connected to me became public property. Families were followed. Personal information appeared online. Private moments became headlines. I gripped the phone tighter. Ethan exhaled slowly on the recording. I told myself that if I kept you separate from all of it, you could have a normal life. A real life. One untouched by my world. Tears blurred my vision. Not because the explanation solved everything. It did not. but because I could hear the sincerity in his voice, the regret, the fear. For years, I had assumed secrecy benefited him. Now I was hearing something entirely different. The final voicemail arrived nearly an hour after the others. His voice sounded quieter than before, almost defeated. Maybe I made the wrong choice. Maybe I should have trusted you enough to let you decide for yourself. I pressed the phone against my chest. The cottage had become completely dark except for a small lamp beside the sofa. Rain began tapping softly against the windows. Then Ethan said one final sentence. A sentence that changed everything. I am coming to find you, Grace. And this time, I am telling you the whole truth. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I heard the lake. Gentle waves brushing against the shoreline. Wind moving through the trees outside. The cottage ceiling above me came into focus, and everything rushed back at once. The letter, the missed calls, the voicemails. Ethan. I sat up slowly and reached for my phone on the nightstand. No new messages. No calls. Somehow that felt worse. Part of me had expected him to keep trying. Another part feared he actually would. I spent the morning walking along the water. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and wet earth. Small fishing boats drifted across the lake beneath a pale gray sky. The town was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where people smiled when they passed each other on the sidewalk. Nobody recognized me. Nobody asked questions. For the first time in years, I was completely invisible. I should have felt free. Instead, I felt empty. Around noon, I stopped at a small cafe overlooking the marina. The owner greeted me by name. I had only been there 3 days. Somehow that simple kindness made my chest ache. Ethan would have loved this place. The thought arrived unexpectedly. I tried pushing it away. It stayed anyway. By late afternoon, rain began falling again. I returned to the cottage and settled beside the window with a book I never actually read. My eyes kept drifting toward the driveway, toward the narrow road disappearing through the trees, toward possibilities I could not stop imagining. The hours crawled by. Evening arrived. Then darkness. At 7:23, headlights appeared outside. My heart jumped so hard it hurt. A vehicle rolled slowly into the gravel driveway and stopped. For several seconds, nobody got out. Rain tapped against the windows while I stared at the silhouette beyond the glass. Then the driver's door opened. Ethan stepped out. He looked different. Not physically. Familiar dark coat. Familiar posture. Familiar face. Yet something about him seemed stripped down. Unprotected. Human. He carried no assistance. No security. No polished public image. Just a worn duffel bag hanging from one shoulder, and exhaustion written across his face. I remained frozen beside the window. Ethan looked toward the cottage. Toward me. Neither of us moved. The rain continued falling between us. Finally, he started walking. Gravel crunched beneath his shoes. Each step felt louder than the last. By the time he reached the porch, my pulse was racing. A soft knock echoed through the cottage. Once. Twice. Then silence. I stood there staring at the door. Every memory of the last 3 years seemed to collide inside my chest at once. The first coffee shop conversation. The late-night phone calls, the hidden dinners, the promises, the disappointments, the love. Another gentle knock. Then Ethan's voice. Quiet. Careful. Grace, he said. I am not here as a billionaire tonight. I closed my eyes. My hand tightened around the doorknob. Outside, rain drummed softly against the roof. Then he spoke 7 words that made my breath catch. I am here because I was wrong. For a moment, neither of us moved. My hand remained on the doorknob. Ethan stood on the porch beneath the rain, water darkening his coat, while the porch light cast long shadows across the wooden boards. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. The kind that comes from carrying something for too long. Slowly, I opened the door. Cool air drifted into the cottage. Ethan stepped inside and quietly set his duffel bag near the entrance. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of rain tapping against the roof. Finally, he looked at me. You were right to leave. The word surprised me. I had expected explanations, defenses, arguments. Instead, he offered honesty. I spent 3 years asking you to trust me, he continued. But I never trusted you with the full truth. I folded my arms tightly across my chest. Then tell me now. Ethan nodded. He walked toward the window overlooking the lake and stared out into the darkness. For several seconds, he seemed to gather his thoughts. When my company started growing, everything changed faster than I was prepared for. Reporters followed people connected to me. Former employees sold private stories. Every relationship became public entertainment. He paused. At first I thought I could handle it. I listened without interrupting. Then I watched people around me lose their privacy completely. Parents, friends, former girlfriends. Their addresses appeared online. Their personal lives became headlines. He turned toward me. I promised myself I would never let that happen to someone I loved. The last words landed softly but carried enormous weight. Loved, not cared about, not protected. Loved. Ethan exhaled slowly. The problem is that somewhere along the way, protecting you became controlling the situation. And controlling the situation became an excuse to keep delaying the future we both deserved. Tears stung my eyes. Because deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. Not all of it, but enough. Why now? I asked quietly. Why are you finally ready? Ethan laughed once. A humorless sound. Because losing you showed me what I was actually protecting. I looked away. The room suddenly felt too small, too emotional, too real. Outside, lightning flashed faintly across distant clouds. The lake shimmered silver for a brief second before darkness returned. Ethan stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough that I could see the sincerity in his eyes. 3 days ago, I walked into a board meeting and realized I could not remember a single word anyone was saying. He smiled sadly. All I could think about was whether you were eating, whether you were sleeping, whether you hated me. Despite everything, a small laugh escaped me. Ethan smiled for the first time that evening. Then his expression turned serious again. Next month, there is a global technology summit in New York. I frowned slightly. Okay, it will be televised. Every major network will be there. My pulse quickened. Something in his tone felt different. Certain. Final. Ethan held my gaze. I spent 3 years hiding the most important person in my life. The rain continued falling outside. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then he said the words that changed everything. At that event, I am telling the world about us. The month passed faster than I expected. One day I was standing beside a quiet lake wondering whether Ethan and I had reached the end of our story. The next, I was back in New York watching the city prepare for one of the biggest business events of the year. Yet even after everything we had discussed at the cottage, doubt lingered. Not because I questioned Ethan's intentions anymore, because I understood the size of what he was about to do. For 3 years, secrecy had defined our relationship. It had become a habit, a shield, a routine neither of us knew how to live without. Now he intended to tear it down in front of millions of people. The morning of the summit arrived cold and clear. Sunlight reflected from the glass towers surrounding Midtown Manhattan. News vans lined the streets outside the convention center. Reporters moved between cameras carrying microphones and tablets. Every major network seemed to be there. I watched everything unfold from a private viewing room several floors above the main stage. Ethan had asked me to stay there until the presentation began. Trust me, he had said. Those 2 words no longer felt like a burden. They felt like a promise. Still, my hands would not stop shaking. Olivia sat beside me on a leather sofa, pretending not to notice my nerves. She had learned the truth only a week earlier. Her reaction had involved 20 seconds of complete silence followed by enough questions to fill an entire notebook. Even now she occasionally stared at me as though she could not believe any of it was real. Below us, thousands of guests filled the auditorium. Executives, investors, journalists, government officials. The energy inside the building felt electric. Then the lights dimmed. Conversations faded. Applause erupted across the massive hall. Ethan walked onto the stage. The sight of him still affected me after all these years. Calm, focused, confident. He moved toward the podium beneath a spotlight, while giant screens projected his image across the room. The audience welcomed him with a standing ovation. Ethan smiled politely and waited for the applause to settle. Then he began speaking. The presentation started exactly as everyone expected. Company achievements, new initiatives, future investments. The crowd responded enthusiastically. Reporters typed notes. Cameras followed every movement. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, nearly 40 minutes into the speech, Ethan stopped. He looked down at the notes resting on the podium. For a moment, the room fell silent. Slowly, he closed the folder. My heart immediately started racing. Olivia grabbed my arm. Ethan looked out across the audience and smiled. Not the practice smile from magazine covers. Not the public smile. The real one. The one I knew. "There is something important I have never shared before," he said. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reporters lowered their heads toward keyboards. Cameras zoomed closer. Ethan glanced toward the viewing room where I was standing behind a glass. Somehow, even from that distance, it felt like he was looking directly at me. Then he spoke the sentence that made the entire auditorium go silent. "The greatest success of my life has nothing to do with business." The silence inside the auditorium felt impossible. Thousands of people sat motionless beneath the glow of stage lights, while Ethan stood at the podium, holding the attention of an entire industry. Nobody expected this. Nobody came here for a personal story. Yet nobody looked away. Ethan rested his hands lightly against the podium and continued speaking. 3 years ago, I met someone in a coffee shop in Brooklyn. A few quiet laughs moved through the crowd. The statement sounded so ordinary, so unlike the life everyone associated with him. Ethan smiled softly. She was grading artwork created by elementary school students. One of them had drawn a dog wearing sunglasses. My eyes immediately filled with tears. Olivia squeezed my arm beside me. On the giant screens above the stage, photographs suddenly appeared. Not professional photographs. Not publicity images. Real moments. A blurry picture of a pizza box sitting on a kitchen counter. A snapshot of 2 paper coffee cups beside a bookstore window. A photograph of a hand-drawn birthday card covered in colorful markers from my students. Tiny pieces of a life nobody knew existed. Audible murmurs spread throughout the audience. Ethan looked toward the images and shook his head with a small laugh. For 3 years, I convinced myself I was protecting her by keeping our relationship private. The room remained silent. Every camera stayed locked on him. What I was really protecting was my own fear. My breath caught. Ethan paused before continuing. Fear that the world would change something beautiful. Fear that attention would damage something precious. Fear that I would lose the person who mattered most. The giant screens shifted again. This time a single photograph appeared. Me, sitting in a small classroom surrounded by student paintings. I remembered the moment instantly. Ethan had taken the picture without telling me while I was helping a child finish an art project after school. My hands trembled. Across the auditorium, people stared at the screen. Then Ethan said my name. Not quietly. Not privately. Publicly. Proudly. Grace Carter changed my life. The audience erupted into surprised whispers. Reporters rushed to type updates. Phones appeared everywhere. Yet Ethan never looked away from the viewing room. She taught me that success means nothing if you have nobody to share it with. She taught me that kindness is more valuable than influence. And she taught me that love cannot live forever in the shadows. Tears streamed freely down my face now. I no longer cared who saw. Ethan stepped away from the podium and looked directly toward the glass above the auditorium. "Grace," he said. My heart nearly stopped. "Would you come down here?" Olivia gasped beside me. The room seemed to blur as I stood. Minutes later, I walked onto the stage beneath thousands of lights. The audience rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the hall. Ethan met me at center stage. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled the same way he had smiled across that coffee shop table 3 years earlier. Familiar. Honest. Home. "I spent too long hiding the best part of my life," he said softly. "I will not make that mistake again." The applause grew louder. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled. Yet somehow none of it mattered. Because for the first time in 3 years, there were no secrets left between us. Later, headlines would call it shocking. Unexpected. Historic. But standing there beside Ethan, I understood something much simpler. Money can buy privacy. Success can build walls. Fear can keep people apart. But sooner or later, the truth asks to be seen. And when it finally is, it can change everything.